So thank you so much for the invitation to take part at the Animal Normativity Workshop, and I'm very happy to present work that I've been part of for the past few years in collaboration with Judith, Burkart and Carel von Schaik. And I'm very much giving this talk on behalf of all three of us. Our presentation is basically a 30-minute footnote on one sentence of Darwin, and this sentence will be very familiar to all of you after Frans de Waal's talks just now. Okay. So at the most basic level, human morality and normativity are about the right and wrong way of how to conduct our social lives, and thus need standards of behavior and an ability to recognize those in others. What we argue is that morality and normativity have an evolutionary history, and this argument has been made ever since Darwin. So there seems to be this kind of continuity of these abilities from animals to humans. But most of the work that has been done in animals is clearly inspired by the main function of human morality and normativity, meaning people want to find out if animals have something like community concern or general rules, often called proto-norms, such as not to attack infants. The features in these comparisons tend to be those where actors are uninvolved bystanders, protecting the weak or maintaining social peace, or even upholding a general norm. And our own work has been focused on these ideas in the past as well. But this is likely not where where morality and normativity began. So for this presentation, we will thus start at the other end, and we will discuss morality and normativity in terms of parent-offspring relationships and dyadic social bonds, thus social interactions where animals are first parties and thus directly interested in behavioral outcomes of these interactions. It's very similar to what Frans de Waal calls one-on-one morality, and we argue that these are the fundamental building blocks of animal and human morality and normativity. So let me illustrate all of this with a diagram. So let's look at the social interaction in a bit more formalized way. We have interactions between first and second parties, and these can be uni or bidirectional. We are of course more interested in bidirectional ones. And those can then be observed by what we often call uninvolved bystanders or third parties. In human morality, it's even often the fourth party that is party perspective, that is what we call the so-called impartial spectators, that is most important. So as I said, human morality focuses mostly on the judgments of third and fourth parties, but here we focus on first and second party morality and normativity. For this, we need, of course, minimal or bare-bone definitions of morality and normativity. So what we define as morality is the motivation to assist others, that can be fellow group members or others in the community. In other words, these are obligations that are expressed in behavior and accompanied by physiological states and emotionally experienced by so-called authoughts, that is the term that Kristen Andrews uses, or also conscience in Churchland's terms. Normativity, as we define it here, are expectations about actions of actual and potential partners. So these are evaluations of social interactions that are again expressed in behavior and accompanied by physiological states, and where those expectations are violated, they're experienced as anger. Now let's come back to this quote, and I hope I can paraphrase it as nicely as Frans de Waal before. So going back to Darwin, he says that any animal, whatever endowed with well-marked social instincts, and then what we focus on, and what Frans de Waal didn't focus on in his talk, the parental and filial affections being here included, would inevitably acquire a moral sense or conscience as soon as its intellectual powers had become as well or nearly as well developed as in man. So as it is obvious after Frans de Waal's presentation, we are not the first to take Darwin's proposal seriously. And this is very similar to Flack and de Waal in 2000. But what we focus on is that we start with parental care, and our focus is more on the cooperation or exchange of cooperative behaviors and less on conflict resolution. Okay, let's look at these parental relationships. So direct parental care involves, on the one hand, the obligation component. So in other words, the motivation to care, feed, and protect. And this is not only reactive, so responding to the offspring's need, but also proactive. And this is really nicely shown by this study here, very old study, where Reese's mother in the first 3 to 4 months of the infant's life are responsible for maintaining the contact with the infant when the infant is wandering off. Can you see my cursor? I hope that is the case. Okay, perfect. Okay. And this urge to provide parental care is proximately regulated by hormones such as estrogens, progesterones, prolactins, and so on, but also neurochemical regulators, the famous oxytocin and vasopressin. And depending on the species, these hormonal and neurochemical regulators vary in the relative importance, but it seems that these physiological correlates are very conserved and presumably accompanied by feelings. This obligation is to care and to feed the offspring is of course expected for parents, but depending on the social system, for example, as shown here in callitrichids, where we have helpers present in groups, the helpers are also having this obligation to care for the offspring, so expressed here in food sharing rates that are as high or even higher as the breeders. And now you could say, of course, oh, but the helpers just want to pay to stay within the group. This is all a reputational concern for them, and this is not the case. So when we look at this with an audience compared to without an audience, the sharing rates when there is an audience, so when there could be a reputational concerns, are much lower than when there is no audience. So it really seems to be that there is this obligation to care for the offspring. We can also look at these experienced obligations from the opposite sides, namely what is happening at the physiological and behavioral levels when parents are separated from the infants. And it's of course expected that the infants experience physiological stress when separated from the mothers, and this is expressed here with very high cortisol plasma levels when separated from the mother compared to a baseline. But what is also the case is that the mothers experience this stress and have elevated cortisol levels when they're separated from the infant. And this is even accompanied, shown in other studies, by signs of behavioral distress. So in this first part, I hope to convince you that we have this obligation or motivation to care, feed, and protect. But what about, but parental care is of course not unconditional. So even though the parents experience this obligation to care, they can also, or they also evaluate the relationship with the offspring. And this is expressed in weaning conflicts and from the infant side with temper tantrums. So shown here is the gradual reduction in investments from the mother's side. So the increase in rejections to allow the infant suckle over time and when it gets closer to weaning. We can also look at this evaluation side of the relationship in callitrichids again, and now not with suckling, but with food sharing. So on the y-axis is the percentage of food shared, and on the x-axis the age of the infant, and the black curve is the total food sharing rate of these parents and also helpers within the group towards the infants. And what is really important is that we see at weaning age a strong decline in sharing rates towards the infants, and these rates are not, this decline is not driven by a less begging in immatures, but much rather the refusal to share despite begging by the adults. So the adults really evaluate the relationship between him or herself and the infant, and then refuse to continue to share food. Okay, so what I hope this first part of the talk convinced you of is that parental care has the basic building blocks of morality, and with the obligation component, and normativity with the evaluation component. Now let's look at this in a much more formalized way. So we are looking at these dyadic interactions. So we have the first party that has a motivation to engage in a cooperative act with the second party, and then also an expectation of what is going to happen next. So the second party then decides to return this cooperative act or not, and dependent on what is happening in this second part of the interaction or in this relationship, this first party is evaluating this relationship and is updating then the motivation of further cooperative interactions or further interactions with this second party. This is experienced by the animal at the emotional level as an obligation, standards and judgment. So the motivation is experienced as an obligation, the evaluation as this judgment, but this is functionally equivalent to our own experienced emotion and what we think of morality and normativity. So what the animal experience as an obligation is functionally equivalent to a moral sense or conscience, or what the animal experience as this evaluation or judgment is what we call a moral judgment. And what is very important is that these motivations, expectations, and evaluations are all adaptive in that they are needed for cooperation to be maintained without being exploited. Okay, now we looked at these parental interactions. Now we want to look at the filial interactions. So what is happening beyond the dependence relationship, such as pair bonds or social bonds among kin and also non-kin. So I was talking about these parental relationships being regulated with these proximate hormones and neurological mechanisms. And what Newman is arguing is that the neural circuits underlying the mother-infant bonding may have provided the primordial neural scaffold upon which other types of strong social bonds are built. So basically saying that what is regulating the parent-offspring relationship is then co-opted in other social relationships, first of all, also in pair bonds. And a very nice indirect evidence for that is that when we look at the phylogenetic tree and look at the presence of pair bonds and parental care, it's really clear that, or it's very obvious to see that only where parental care is present, there is also pair bonding. So it seems that parental care is providing the stepping stone upon which pair bonding then can evolve in these lineages. And a very neat evidence that shows that these pair bonds are very regulated in a very similar way as the parent-offspring relationship is this study here from Washer and colleagues in Geese, where pair partners, that shows that when pair partners are watching their pair mates involved in an agonistic interaction, their physiological reaction expressed here in the increase in heart rate on the left-hand side is much stronger than compared when they're watching a non-affiliated bystander. So these the mechanisms that regulate parental care also regulate pair bonds and also regulate kin-based bonds, which is not so surprising because of inclusive fitness. But what is much more interesting is now to look at if these same mechanisms are also present for non-kin friendships. But what are those non-kin friendships, or what are social bonds? So social bonds in animals are defined as the selective feeling of trust and affinity towards a particular group members, and it doesn't have to be necessarily one single one. And it reflects the history of interactions and thus predicts future interactions with other and with their group mates. It is operationalized by in different ways. It is, for example, with high proximity or grooming rates, high tolerance, reduced aggression, reconciliation after conflicts, and then again, similar to what has been shown in parent-offspring relationships, evidence for distress upon separation or loss. So these bonds, kin, same-sex, non-kin, and pair bonds are the main context of dyadic cooperation in primates. And so now again, evidence for that these regulations of these social bonds are similar between what is present in parent-offspring, now also in non-kin bonds, is a very famous studies from Crockford and et al. From 2013, where they could show that oxytocin levels in urine that are sampled 30 minutes after a grooming bout between two chimpanzees was elevated when it was between bonded individuals. So and when they were grooming, of course, compared to when they were not grooming. So this regulation with oxytocin supports these notions of happiness and trust, and it supports especially this seemingly anthropocentric interpretation of social bonds. Now coming back to this diagram, where we want to talk about the obligation component within social bonds. There is also experimental evidence for that, with a very old study, or pretty old study, from Seyfarth and Genius, also very famous. So they observed pairs of vervet monkeys grooming each other, and the control was that they observed the same pair without grooming. Then they played back the scream of a former groomer to the groomee, and then they videotaped the response of the of what was happening towards this playback. So the duration of the response by the groomee was that when there was prior grooming, the response was much higher than compared to when there was no grooming. So they found that grooming increased the short-term willingness to attend a request for help, because these playbacks were basically recruitment calls. Another experimental evidence, or another way to show this, that grooming can buy this agonistic support, or grooming elicits this obligation, was a study by Hemmelrich and colleagues in 1994. So what they did was that they put syrup on the fur of some long-tailed macaques. It was a study in captivity, and then that elicited grooming by a certain other individual, because they wanted, of course, to remove these seeds and so on from the fur of this individual bee. Then they provoked an attack by C upon A, and then they checked what was B doing, or what was the response of B. So if A grooms B, does this install this obligation to return the favor now that C is attacking A? And what they could show is that B supports A in most of the time when A has groomed B before, a bit less when there was bidirectional grooming, and the least when there was no grooming before. So it seems, so a lot of observational studies seem to show that this grooming can buy support, or grooming can install this obligation to return a cooperative act. There is ample support for this reciprocation of grooming with support, but usually the grooming comes first. So the grooming needs to be done first. We can also look at that, or one can also look at these reciprocations in much more derived ways. So when it's about food sharing or food reciprocation with mechanistic apparatuses, or when it's about token exchanges that involve food. And in these contexts, there is much less evidence. So there are some species that can learn to reciprocate, or to do this in these more derived contexts, but it's much less successful. So the origin of this obligation seems to be specific to the grooming context, and others seem to be learned. And here we are like very much in line with what Darwin says. So as soon as its intellectual powers had become as well or nearly as well developed as in men, so basically supporting this fact that to have this morality, the contexts that are more derived, it has to be learned, and so the animal needs to have enough intellectual or enough domain general intelligence to do it. But I will get back to this. So now We talked about the motivation or obligation component. Let's talk about the evaluation. The evaluation within social bonds can happen through partner control or partner choice. And there has been a lot of this in the primate. There has been a lot of experiments that look at this in the primate literature. And what we find, or what people have reviewed have shown, is that there is very little evidence for partner control. But what we seem to find is that these private norms at the dyadic level exist. But the problem is a bit that in nature, the partner control and partner choice, it's very difficult to separate it out, and it's also very under-researched. So what I'm showing next is basically a naturalistic example of clear evidence for partner control and partner choice. And I will show that again in an example of callitrichids. So where we think we can show this partner control and partner choice. So let's see. I hope this will work. So what you can see here, or what you will be seeing here, is an infant transfer in wild callitrichids. So on the right-hand side, there is the infant carrier. On the left-hand side, individual so individual B is approaching. So individual A on the right-hand side is ready to pass on the infant, but individual B is clearly refused as a carrier. So you can see individual A is refusing and basically controlling the access to the infant, so partner control. And this goes on for a while. Still, some time has passed and he's still not accepted. He's continued to be refused. And now you will be seeing another individual that is arriving from the left-hand side. He also clearly refuses individual B. And now the infant transfer is successful. So individual A chooses in group member C as the next carrier and clearly showing partner choice. So all of the boxes for this partner control and partner choice are ticked by the callitrichids. Okay, sorry, I didn't want to play it again. This, of course, needs much more formalized works, and we have projects in the work that will look at this, but it seems to be a very powerful paradigm to look at partner choice and partner control. And the callitrichid example shows that this evaluation component in our scheme works. But what is also important to say is that callitrichids are very small-brained primates. So the callitrichids tick all the boxes. They have this obligation component, but also the evaluation component, and thus it seems that the cognitive abilities are probably not the limiting factor for morality and normativity, thus coming back to Darwin, where we have to say that we most likely disagree with him on the importance of these cognitive domain general processes. Okay, I want to go further. I hope it works. Okay, so one step now, going back, going beyond this diet, going one step beyond the diet. So if we have this partner choice, we can also look at the evaluation of these first and second party interactions by a third party. So where we, in all the situations where we have stable social units, third parties have an interest in eavesdropping and evaluating these interactions. And this is, as I said, especially true if we have partner choice. To look at this, we performed an experiment again with common marmosets, where we separated them from the family group into an experimental cage and played back different interactions. So first they experienced the baseline of 60 seconds, and then they experienced the playback. So what we did is we simulated interactions with combinations of calls. So we simulated these first and second party interactions with different combinations of calls. We either simulated the cooperative interaction with begging calls and food calls, or an aggressive interactions with begging calls and chatter calls. So this individual on the left-hand side would listen, eavesdrop on these first and second party interaction, and thus we hoped to show evaluation of these interactions. So how did we measure this evaluation? So what we did is we had a second compartment that from where the playback was played back from, and after the animal experienced the playback, we opened this compartment and together the access to the home cage, and then the animal could decide to explore this additional compartment. And what we could show is that the probability of approaching this second compartment was much lower when the animal had heard the aggressive interaction. So there is a longer latency to look for the conspecific, and if they heard the aggressive playback. So what we seem to show is that the individuals evaluate the interaction that they just heard, that they evaluate based on the vocal interactions that they just perceived. Okay, let's sum this all up. So what we wanted to show with this talk is that we have motivation that is perceived as an obligation, and the evaluation which reflects the standards that are the foundation of human and animal morality and normativity. Second, we argue that human and animal morality and normativity arose in dependence relationship and were co-opted for interdependence relationship. So we go from parental offspring relationship to non-kin social bonds. And what is also very important is that the expression and elaboration of morality and normativity is the function of a species' social life. So if we have a species like humans, where we have cooperative breeding and hunting, that are interactions that go beyond the diets, that then normativity and morality also need to be something that goes beyond the diet. Yes, and with that, I thank you all for listening to me, and I am happy to answer any questions.